A beggar old woman gave her last money to a young man for a ticket, and 8 years later, a brand new Maybach pulled up to her shack. Everything had truly gone wrong for Carla. Life, once full of warmth and care, had now become mere existence. 17 years ago, she experienced the most terrible tragedy, the death of her eldest daughter. Irma was a midwife, helping newborns come into the world. She had always taken pride in her work, even though it drained her strength. That day had seemed ordinary. Her daughter was coming home after a long shift. One of her patients was having a difficult labor, both mother and child were at risk, and it required all her effort. And then, exhausted, she was driving down the familiar road, dreaming of rest, when her life was cut short in an instant. A driver in the oncoming lane lost control at high speed, and no one survived the crash. Since then, an incurable pain had settled in the old woman's heart. Every day, she remembered her daughter, her laughter, her care, and her devotion to her work. But the streak of misfortune didn't end there. A few years ago, Carla lost another loved one, her husband, Donald. They had been together for over 40 years, hand in hand, facing all the hardships and joys of life. After his death, the old woman was left alone in a house that now felt empty and cold. Carla often sat by the window, watching life flow by outside the glass. She was left alone with her youngest daughter, an unplanned but nonetheless cherished child. The girl was born when the woman was no longer young, but their family had more than enough love. Together with Donald, they adored their little girl and spoiled her as best they could. They thought that if they surrounded their child with care and love, without imposing strict boundaries and rules, she would grow up happy and free. But over time, it became clear that this parenting strategy did not always yield the results they had hoped for. As a child, the daughter was sweet and cheerful, but as she grew older, her whims and indifference to others' feelings became more pronounced. Her father could still keep her in check, soothe her, and guide her, but after his death, it became apparent that they had raised a monster incapable of empathy. The youngest daughter became a real trial for the elderly woman, who was already struggling with loneliness and loss. Now the girl not only didn't care for her mother, but she also seemed irritated and angry whenever the old woman spoke to her. "Esther, could you buy me some groceries?" "Just a few things, bread, vegetables, rice," the old woman asked one day, holding the phone with both hands. Esther sighed heavily. "Do you need something again? You just asked me to buy medicine yesterday." "Fine, I'll go," she replied, but her tone was so irritated that the old woman's heart sank. "I'm sorry, darling, if this is too much trouble for you," she said quietly. "Maybe I'll manage on my own." "Why do you keep starting again?" Esther interrupted, abruptly getting up from the couch. "All right, I'll go. But couldn't you just not ask me sometimes? I have my own things to do too." Carla didn't respond. She knew that any word from her could only anger her daughter more. She simply nodded and looked at her phone, trying not to cry. Every time she needed something, she would think long and hard before asking. But living alone was difficult, and she had to reach out to her daughter from time to time. However, it was becoming increasingly hard to do so. Esther continued living her life, not realizing that her mother needed basic care. It seemed that all her actions were aimed at getting rid of this burden as quickly as possible. The old woman felt more and more like a burden to her daughter, and each day it became harder to even ask for the essentials. One day, Carla decided that she didn't want to bother her daughter anymore and resolved to go to the store by herself. She wasn't even deterred by the rain tapping against the windows, as if reminding her that leaving the house was not the best idea. But there was hardly any food left at home, and asking Esther for anything was not worth it. She put on her old coat, tied her favorite colorful scarf around her head, took her bag and the last money she had left, and trudged through the rain-soaked streets. Well, with God's help. Walking slowly, with each drop of rain, she felt the fatigue pressing more heavily on her shoulders. It seemed as if even the weather was against her. Nevertheless, the old woman resolutely moved forward toward the store. As she approached the door, something unusual caught her eye. In the street, among the gray crowd of hurried passers-by, a young man stood out. He looked barely 18. He seemed confused, almost on the verge of tears, and was running up to each person, asking something, but his efforts were in vain. People just passed by indifferently, not stopping. The old woman paused for a moment, watching him. The sight tore Carla's heart apart because she knew what it was like to be left without help. She stepped closer, deciding to find out what had happened. "Young man, is something wrong?" she asked cautiously, approaching him and extending her hand to catch his attention. The young man turned his anxious eyes toward her. He clearly did not expect anyone to offer help. He looked lost and exhausted, his face was tear-streaked, and his clothes were soaked from the rain. As soon as he got closer, he began to speak, as if afraid he would be ignored again. "I'm so sorry," he started, breathless with anxiety. "I really need help. I was traveling to the next town to visit my sister. She's sick, but I overslept my station. While I was sleeping, my bag was stolen. All my money was in there. Luckily, my passport was in my jacket." He paused for a moment, lowering his eyes as if ashamed of his helplessness. The old woman frowned, listening carefully to the boy. His words sounded sincere, and she could see how frightened he was. "None of the conductors even woke me up," he continued, his voice trembling with indignation. "They just waved me off and kicked me off at the final station. I tried asking for help there at the station, but no one wanted to listen. They just threw me out. Now I'm wandering the streets, not knowing where to go or what to do." The old woman scrutinized his face. It pained her to see such despair. She had experienced too many losses and pain in her life, and she knew what it was like to be in a difficult situation and not know where to turn for help. "Oh, poor thing," she sighed, looking at the young man sympathetically. "Well, what a situation. Don't worry, everything will be all right." The young man helplessly tried to continue. "I just need a train ticket," his voice trembled. "My older sister is sick, she's alone, and I promised I would come. I don't know what to do," he sobbed, lowering his eyes as if ashamed of his tears. The boy nodded, wiping his face with his hand. The rain had calmed down but continued to drizzle, adding an even grayer, more dreary tone to the scene. Carla thought for a long time before deciding. She looked closely at the unfortunate young man. He stood before her like a cornered animal, pale with fear, his eyes red and filled with tears. In his gaze, there was only one question: would no one help him? The old woman's heart ached. Carla paused for a moment. On one hand, she had almost no money herself, but on the other, her heart had long since grown sympathetic to others' pain. She could imagine how worried this boy was about his sister, who was likely in a serious condition. And how worried his parents must be if they knew their son was missing, left alone, without help, in an unfamiliar city. "How long have you been wandering around here?" she asked gently, not taking her eyes off his ridden gaze. "Since this morning," he replied. "I didn't even notice when I overslept my station. When I woke up, my bag was already gone. The conductors just kicked me off at the final stop and said they couldn't help me. No one at the station listened either. Now I'm here, wandering the streets, and there's hardly any time left until the station closes." The old woman nodded, unsure what to say. Her thoughts returned to the money. She pulled out her old wallet, slowly opened it, and looked inside. There was hardly any money left, but perhaps there would be just enough for a ticket. She sighed and extended her last savings to the boy. "Take this," she said softly, smiling slightly. "It should be enough for a ticket. Get to your sister, so she won't worry. Money is trivial compared to the fact that you can be with her." The young man froze in shock, unable to believe that someone had decided to help him. Tears filled his eyes again, but this time they were not from despair but from gratitude. Thank you so much," he said, grabbing the old woman's hand. "I'll definitely pay you back." "You don't have to," she interrupted, waving her hand. "The main thing is to get to your sister. The rest doesn't matter." The young man was long in expressing his gratitude, his voice trembling with excitement and joy. He quickly said goodbye and nearly ran toward the station, feeling that salvation was near. The old woman, watching his departing figure, slowly turned and walked back toward her home. Thoughts that her daughter would surely be outraged again if she found out how she had spent her money flashed through her mind. But these thoughts no longer felt so heavy. After all, she had done a good deed, helped when no one else would. So it didn't matter. As she had expected, her daughter's visit began with a small scene. Esther appeared at the doorstep a few hours after the call, her usual displeased expression on her face. She was holding a bag of groceries, but her mood was evident from her sharp movements and cold tone. "Mom, I told you not to do that anymore," she exclaimed angrily as she stepped inside. "I said that if you need something, just call me. Why did you decide to go to the store by yourself? You could fall or catch a cold. And then I'd have to deal with you." Carla sighed, slowly lifting her eyes to her daughter but saying nothing. She didn't want to justify herself again, knowing the conversation would lead nowhere. Esther tossed the bag onto the table, continuing to grumble. "And you hardly have any money left. Why do you keep helping strangers? Do you think they'll pay you back?" she added sarcastically, pulling out bread, milk, and a couple of vegetables from the bag. "Everyone is taking advantage of your kindness, and you let them." The old woman smiled softly, but not in response to her daughter's anger. She was recalling the young man she had helped. Someone's child will definitely make it home, she thought to herself. For her, that was all that mattered. Money didn't mean anything. The important thing was that the boy wouldn't be left alone in an unfamiliar city, frightened and helpless. "Esther," she finally said gently, trying to soften her daughter's anger, "I did what I thought was right. That boy, he was like a lost puppy, completely alone, soaked to the skin. He needed a little help. Is it really so terrible to help someone in a tough moment?" "Terrible?" Esther snapped back, her eyes filled with indignation. "You don't understand, Mom. You constantly let people take advantage of you. And then I have to figure out how to manage the money and cover all your needs. This can't go on." The old woman nodded, knowing that arguing was pointless. Her daughter had always been pragmatic and didn't understand the simplicity and kindness that had always been a part of her mother's life. "I know, dear," she said quietly, lowering her eyes. "I don't want you to worry. It's just that sometimes, people need help more than we can imagine." Esther sighed heavily, closing the bag, and for a moment softened, feeling that her sharpness was somewhat unfair. But despite this, she still couldn't understand her mother. "All right, Mom," she said a little more calmly, but still coldly. "I bought you some groceries. I hope this time you won't decide to give them away to the neighbors. And please, don't go to the store alone anymore. I'll come when I can." "Thank you, dear," the old woman replied, nodding. "I'll try." Her daughter quickly gathered her things, glanced at her mother, and left the door without waiting for an answer to her question. Esther always found it hard to understand why her mother couldn't break her bad habit of helping people, even if it put her in a difficult position. As soon as the door slammed shut, silence returned to the house. Carla sat in her favorite chair by the window, feeling her heart warmed, despite her daughter's discontent, by the fact that she had helped the young man. She continued to live as she had before that day, in her own rhythm, taking each day as an opportunity to do something good. The sounds of traffic came from the street, but for her, that noise had become a familiar backdrop, just like all the other little things that filled her quiet life. 8 years passed, and the old woman waited with bated breath for the long-awaited event, her daughter's wedding. Her heart felt warm at the thought that her daughter had finally found her happiness. She had always worried about whether Esther would meet someone who would take care of her, but thankfully, that day had come. The man who had won her daughter's heart was from another city. The old woman knew a little about him. He was handsome, had a respectable profession, and, as Esther said, treated her with love. That was enough for the woman to feel at ease. Although her daughter often brushed off detailed inquiries, mentioning only that they were both happy, the old woman couldn't contain her excitement. One day, when she and her daughter were sitting over cups of coffee, Esther casually informed her, Mom, Anthony has decided that everything should be done according to tradition. The old woman lifted her gaze from her plate and looked at her daughter in surprise. According to tradition? What do you mean, dear? Well, her daughter sighed, clearly displeased at having to explain. He wants to ask for my hand. Can you believe it? Carla straightened up, feeling her heart race. Ask for your hand? That's very unexpected, she said, trying to hide her excitement. But that's good, right? Her daughter just rolled her eyes, leaning back in her chair. Oh, Mom, who does that nowadays? I tried to explain to him that it's outdated, but he's stubborn. He wants everything to be by the book. And as if that wasn't enough, his parents also want to come and meet you. The old woman pressed her hands to her chest, astonished by the news. His parents? Coming here, she asked, feeling a slight panic rising in her throat. Yes, her daughter continued, visibly dissatisfied. For some reason, they think it's necessary. Blessings, introductions. I don't understand why they need this. The mother fell silent, trying to process what she had just heard. At first glance, it all seemed right, even touching. A man who takes traditions seriously wants to make everything official. But Esther, judging by her reaction, clearly wasn't thrilled. But this is good, the old woman finally said cautiously, trying to ease the tension. Anthony is showing that he respects you and your family. Isn't that important? Maybe, her daughter replied reluctantly, looking away. It just seems unnecessary to me. We've already decided everything, why all this theatrics? Carla pressed her lips together, trying to figure out how to best support her daughter. She knew that Esther had never liked traditions and formalities, always striving to be independent and self-sufficient. You know, she began gently, when your father asked for my hand from your grandmother, I also thought at first that it was just a formality. But then I realized how important it was for both of us. It was a sign of respect for the family, for those close to your partner. Her daughter remained silent, but her face softened a little. She looked at her mother, and it seemed that her own stubbornness was beginning to wane. All right, she sighed. If it's so important to him, let it be. Just, Mom, I ask you not to get nervous. You know I don't like all this pomp. The old woman smiled and nodded. I won't, dear, I won't. The main thing is that you are happy. Her daughter chuckled softly. I'm already happy. I just didn't think I'd have to go through all this. You'll see, her mother added with a smile. Sometimes old traditions bring more joy than we expect. But deep down, the old woman was still a bit anxious. Meeting the groom's parents, the request for her daughter's hand, it was more than she had imagined. And although her heart was filled with joy, the excitement about the upcoming events wouldn't let go. On the other hand, Esther left her mother's house feeling as dark as a storm cloud. She increasingly wanted to avoid conversations with her mother. Every time she picked up the phone and heard her voice, something inside her would tighten, and irritation would flare up as if on cue. She couldn't even explain to herself why this was happening. Her mother had always been gentle, trying not to disturb her unnecessarily, but every conversation seemed to unleash a whirlwind of emotions in her, with anger taking the lead. Where is this feeling coming from, she asked herself, but there was no answer. Her mother continued to live in the old, dilapidated house that had long begun to fall apart. The walls, once warm and cozy, now resembled some kind of shack. For years, she and her father had tried to keep it in order, but after Donald's death, the woman could no longer manage the household, and her daughter was not eager to help in any way. She knew that this house was full of memories, but it didn't affect her. Why should I care for her if I have my own life, she thought, trying to suppress her guilt. She herself lived in a cozy apartment that she had inherited after her sister's death. The apartment was bright and spacious, with windows that offered a view of the city. Once, she had thought she could start a new life here. But that feeling of freedom was strange and unreliable. To some extent, she felt ashamed for living in this apartment, which seemed to still hold the shadow of her sister, Irma. Every time she crossed the threshold, a strange sense of awkwardness washed over her. "Why do you never come to visit?" her mother asked her on the phone one evening. Her voice was soft, as if filled with weariness. "I miss you, dear." "I have a lot to do, Mom," she replied tersely, even though she knew perfectly well that she could find time if she wanted to. But something inside her held her back from visiting that old house. "I understand," her mother replied. There was no reproach or complaint in her voice, but that made it even harder. "Still, come when you can." She hung up, feeling a stab of guilt, which quickly transformed into the familiar irritation. "Why should I come? I visit her enough as it is. Why more often?" These thoughts were harsh but honest. Her mother had become a burden she wasn't ready to carry. Every visit, every request dragged her down, made her feel guilty, even though she truly wanted to live her own life. The apartment she now lived in had become her refuge. Here she could shut herself off from the past, from the old house, from memories. But no matter how hard she tried to escape that feeling of guilt, it always found her. The day of the meeting arrived, but despite the significance of the event, the house was filled not only with the usual hustle and bustle but also with a tension that was impossible to ignore. Her daughter had spent days not leaving her mother's house, but not out of concern, rather from unbearable irritation. She wandered from room to room, tidying up, muttering under her breath, "This house is falling apart, Mom. Have you ever thought about renovating? How can you live like this?" Esther hurled sharp reproaches at her mother, not bothering to hide her contempt. The old woman tried to ignore it, lowering her eyes and continuing to wipe the old, scratched table. She had long since gotten used to her daughter's perpetually bad mood, but at such moments, it seemed to worsen more than usual. "I can't do everything by myself, dear," she replied quietly, trying to soften the tense atmosphere. "This house, it's as old as I am." Her daughter merely scoffed. "Excuses, as always. Everything in this house is a reminder of how you've let your life go. And now I'm forced to clean it up," she shot back, casting an angry glance at her mother. Carla sighed heavily, looking at her daughter with sadness. It seemed that over the years, her coldness and bitterness had only intensified, and it was unclear what had affected her daughter so deeply. There was disdain in her gaze, and every request from her mother only poured more fuel on the fire. "This isn't even your idea," her daughter suddenly said, throwing the cloth onto the table. "If it weren't for Anthony, I wouldn't even have started this pointless meeting." "I'm glad they want to meet," the old woman said quietly, not lifting her eyes. "It's the right thing to do. Anthony is a good man, I can see that. What do you know about good people?" Esther retorted sharply, turning to the window just as a brand new Maybach pulled up in front of the shabby house. "Here they are," she whispered through clenched teeth. The car doors opened, and the groom's parents and his older sister stepped out. Dressed in expensive clothing, exuding polish, their faces radiated friendliness. They glanced around the old house with light smiles, but being well-mannered people, they didn't let on that anything unsettled them. Seeing this, Carla sighed with relief, but then suddenly noticed how the groom stepped out of the car, paused, and looked at her. She froze. For some reason, he seemed familiar to her. His face, his gaze, everything awakened something long forgotten in her memory, something fleeting. He walked toward her with a slight smile on his face, but the same surprise was evident in his eyes, as if he recognized her too. "Have we met somewhere before?" he said, a hint of embarrassment in his voice as he extended his hand. The old woman cautiously shook his hand, feeling the excitement rise within her. "Maybe," she replied softly, unable to recall where that feeling came from. That evening, when everyone gathered around the modest table in the dilapidated house, the tension in the air began to slowly dissipate. The daughter, still displeased and irritated, sat silently across from the groom, occasionally throwing quick glances at her mother. She couldn't understand how this house, which she despised, could become the place for dinner with her beloved's parents. The young man smiled and, seemingly casually, began to tell a story. "You know, once I almost got lost in this city," he said, looking directly at the old woman as if already guessing her reaction. I was just a teenager then. I was heading to my sister's, and I ended up getting dropped off at the last stop. I was left alone, without money or a phone. A kind elderly woman in a colorful scarf came to my rescue. The old woman froze for a moment, and then her face lit up. It was as if she remembered something long forgotten, something that had been buried deep in her memory all this time. Her heart began to race as she got up and walked toward the old wardrobe that stood in the corner of the room. Opening its creaky doors, she pulled out an old but still vibrant scarf. "Is this the scarf you're talking about?" she asked with a smile, carefully unfolding the fabric. The young man smiled in surprise and joy, and a spark instantly appeared in his eyes. "Yes, that's it," he replied, standing up and moving toward her. "That was the day it rained cats and dogs. In that scarf, you looked like a beacon in the middle of a gray sea. I'll never forget that moment. Thank you." He embraced the old woman with such warmth that she felt her heart fill with happiness. At that moment, she finally understood why Anthony seemed vaguely familiar to her. He was the very boy she had helped many years ago on that rainy day when she had just needed to go to the store. "I remember that day," she said softly, stroking his shoulder. "You were so lost, and I gave you everything I had, a little money for a ticket and some warm words. I never thought we would meet again." The young man smiled warmly, and his eyes sparkled with gratitude. "My sister was very sick then," he began to tell her, glancing at his older sister, who sat next to their parents. "She was studying in the capital and ended up in the hospital. Mom and Dad couldn't leave work to be with her. All the money went to her treatment, and they just couldn't afford to travel. So I, still quite young, made that long trip alone to help in any way I could. And if it weren't for you," he paused for a moment, his voice trembling. "If it weren't for your help, I wouldn't have made it to her." The old woman looked at him with a gentle smile, feeling her heart swell with joy at the realization that her assistance had truly mattered once. "I can't imagine what a nightmare it would have been for Mom and Dad if I had disappeared that day," he added, hugging her tighter. At that moment, the groom's parents, who had quietly watched the scene unfold, smiled with silent gratitude. "We've heard this story before," the groom's father said, smiling. "But we never thought we would meet that very woman. Thank you for helping our son back then. We are endlessly grateful to you." The groom's sister, Lori, who had been silently observing the touching scene all along, also smiled warmly at the old woman, as if she wanted to convey all her gratitude through that glance. "Thank you for being there during that difficult time," she quietly said. The old woman felt all her worries and fears of the day vanish. She suddenly realized that perhaps this day was not just a coincidence, but a gift from fate that had brought them together once again. Clara eagerly invited her guests to the table, which was covered with modest but lovingly prepared dishes. In the small, cozy living room, a warm atmosphere prevailed despite the simplicity of the decor. The whole room was filled with the spirit of the past, photographs hung on the walls, each connected to significant moments in life. These frames were like living reminders for the old woman of the times gone by, of the family they once had. An informal conversation began, and the guests were taking their seats at the table, but suddenly the groom's mother froze. Her gaze caught on one of the photographs on the wall. She stood up, moved closer, and, unable to contain her curiosity, took the frame in her hands. It depicted a young woman in a white medical coat standing by a stele with a red cross. It was clear that this was a medical school graduate, ready to begin her professional life. Amber studied the photograph intently, as if trying to understand something, and suddenly asked quietly, "Excuse me, but who is this woman? She looks so... I don't even know how to explain. Is she a relative of yours?" Seeing the lively interest in the guest's eyes, the old woman approached closer with a hint of sadness in her own. "Yes, this is my eldest daughter, Irma," she said softly, gently stroking the edge of the photograph with her fingers. "She was a midwife, helping children come into the world." The groom's mother perked up, her question still not exhausted. "And where is she now? Could we meet her?" For a moment, silence fell, and the old woman sighed heavily. Alas, she is no longer with us. The old woman's voice trembled slightly, but she tried to stay composed. That was many years ago. She had an accident coming home from work. Very tired, she just couldn't react in time when a car came into her lane. Everyone in the room froze. Even Esther, who had been sulking in silence until then, slightly raised her head and looked at her mother. All those present were shocked by the story, but tried not to show it, so as not to worsen the woman's pain. She was so kind, Clara continued, almost to herself, stroking the frame with the photograph. Her whole life was dedicated to helping others. But fate had other plans. The sister-in-law, noticeably pale, slowly returned the photograph to its place. Her hands trembled, and deep sorrow was evident in her eyes. Her husband, noticing her state, moved closer and, seeing the same photograph, also stopped as if in shock. His gaze filled with compassion, and a shadow of memory crossed his face. The old woman, noticing this, quietly asked, "Is something wrong? Do you recognize someone?" Amber took a quiet breath, and her voice trembled slightly. 25 years ago, when our son was born. Those were the most terrifying days of my life. The delivery was so difficult that I almost died. The doctor said we had little chance, but one doctor, she didn't back down. She stayed with me until the end while I fought for my life. She saved me and my son. She looked at the old woman. I will never forget her face, she continued quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. It was her. The groom's mother pointed to the photograph of the old woman's daughter. Your daughter. It was Irma who saved us that day. The old woman slowly turned her gaze to her daughter's photograph. Her heart clenched, and tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't utter a word. We never got to thank her, the sister-in-law continued, lowering her head. After our son was born, we moved to another city because my husband got a job offer and we couldn't return to that maternity hospital. I never got to tell her how grateful I was for what she did. And now, she trailed off, unable to find the words. The groom's mother's husband, who had been silently standing nearby the whole time, gently wrapped his arm around her shoulders, trying to comfort her. We are so sorry, he said slowly, looking at the old woman. At that time, we didn't have the chance. We were so consumed by the new circumstances, the move, life with a newborn. But we never forgot that we owe Irma everything. She gave us our son, and for that, we are forever indebted to her. The old woman listened silently, tightly clutching the hem of her worn cardigan. Her eyes filled with tears, but she tried to hold it together. The words of the couple touched her deeply. She knew how devoted her daughter had been to her profession, and the fact that her efforts had once saved a family only added to her pride. Thank you for remembering, Carla said softly, her voice trembling. She always wanted to help people. To see those she saved before her is simply wonderful. The groom's mother, feeling tears welling in her eyes, whispered, "We will never forget what she did for us. She became an angel for our family." The old woman nodded. Silence fell in the room, but there was no awkwardness in that silence, only an understanding shared by all present. The silent scene was suddenly interrupted by the groom. His voice rang out firm and confident. "We can still thank the mother of this wonderful woman. She is here with us," he said, looking at Carlo with deep warmth. Meanwhile, the bride, who had been standing aside all this time, remained silent. But within her, a different struggle was taking place. She realized that it wasn't going to be as easy to separate herself from her mother as she had hoped. All these years, she had avoided meetings, distanced herself, and tried to build her life separately from her. But now, seeing how her fiancé and his parents were filled with respect and warmth toward this woman, her anger and irritation only grew stronger. The feast began. At first glance, everything seemed peaceful, polite conversations, light jokes, but the atmosphere between the mother and daughter remained tense. Carla tried to be hospitable, serving dishes she had lovingly prepared, but her daughter couldn't hide her dissatisfaction. Her face showed unmistakable irritation, and her gaze occasionally darted across the table as if something were amiss. Each time she picked up a spoon or fork, she grimaced. Her face contorted in distaste, and she clearly didn't try to hide her feelings about what was on the table. Periodically, quiet mutterings could be heard as she made unflattering remarks to herself. "What is this slop?" she murmured barely audibly, pushing away her plate of mashed potatoes. "The meat seems overcooked," she grumbled a little louder as she pushed a piece to the edge of her plate. The groom, sitting next to her, shot her a quick glance, clearly noticing her displeasure but hesitant to comment in front of everyone. He tried to maintain a conversation with his parents and the bride's mother, praising her hospitality. "You put so much effort into the dinner," he said to the old woman with a sincere smile. "Everything is so delicious. You're an amazing host." The old woman smiled modestly, bowing her head. "I just wanted everything to go well. I don't have guests very often." But her daughter couldn't hold back and made a sharp remark. "It could be better," she muttered, hoping no one would hear. Unfortunately, the words reached everyone at the table. A tense silence settled in the room for a moment. The groom turned to her and said quietly but firmly, "Esther, be kinder." The bride rolled her eyes but remained silent, though some spite still glimmered in her gaze. For her, this day was far from ideal. She felt that everything in her mother's house, from the food to the atmosphere, was shamefully cheap, and she couldn't conceal her contempt. Noticing Esther's discontent, the groom finally couldn't hold back and quietly but insistently asked, "Esther, what don't you like? Why are you behaving this way?" At his words, the girl reacted with unexpected aggression. The dissatisfaction she had been trying to conceal burst forth. "Why? You're asking me why," she began sarcastically, pushing her plate away. "Look at this table. Is this all she can do? It's such an important occasion, a wedding, meeting your family, respectable people. Doesn't that deserve at least a little effort?" Anthony looked at her in surprise, not understanding where all the anger was coming from. He tried to interrupt her. "Esther, enough, this isn't the time or place." But the bride had no intention of stopping. "She never loved me," Esther continued, ignoring her fiancé's outraged gaze. "She spent her whole life hovering around Irma and Dad. She worked hard for them, but for me, I've always been left with the scraps. Even now, when she has the chance to show that I'm at it too, that I deserve her attention, she brings this." Esther gestured toward the table laden with food. "This is just shameful." Carla sat in silence. Her eyes became sad, but she made no sound, only lowered her head to avoid looking at her daughter. The words cut deeply, but she had learned to endure a long time ago. It was clear that they affected her, but she knew that any attempt to defend herself would only worsen the situation. Anthony tried to intervene. "Esther, that's not true. You're being unfair. Your mother is not young anymore. You just don't understand how hard it is for people her age." But Esther waved her hand sharply, cutting him off. "You don't understand anything. You weren't here, you don't know what it's like to feel unwanted. I grew up in this house, but I never felt like I was welcome here. Everything was always for them, for Dad, for my already deceased sister. And me? I was always second place. And it's still happening." The old woman continued to sit silently, her shoulders slightly slumped. It seemed she didn't know what to say or how to justify herself. Her eyes sparkled with unshed tears, but she didn't utter a word. She knew there was nothing she could change now, and her heart ached from the pain caused by her own daughter's words. The rest of the evening passed in awkward silence. Amber and her husband, Thomas, now avoided eye contact and tried to shift their focus to something else. Anthony, realizing the awkwardness of the situation, attempted to engage in some conversation, but all his efforts were in vain. The bride, on the other hand, had withdrawn into herself, burying her face in her phone and demonstratively ignoring everything happening at the table. It seemed that for her, this evening was just a formality she wanted to forget as quickly as possible. As the evening came to a close, the groom's family began to gather their things. It was already dark outside, and the guests, politely thanking their hosts for the meal, began to say their goodbyes. The groom and bride were the first to step outside, where their car was waiting, while the couple lingered for a few minutes to express their gratitude to the old woman. The groom's mother warmly embraced the hostess, smiling sincerely. "Thank you so much for the evening," she said softly. "You've done so much for us, and we truly appreciate it. You're a wonderful woman, and I'm sorry we met under such circumstances. But I'm glad we had this opportunity." Carla nodded, her eyes filling with gratitude. She wasn't used to such warm words, but she felt they came from the heart. "Thank you for your kindness," she replied quietly. "I'm also very happy to have met you." Thomas stepped forward and shook the old woman's hand, adding, "You made this evening special. It was a pleasure to be in your home. We'll definitely stop by tomorrow before we leave," he promised. "We won't leave without properly saying goodbye." "Yes, of course, I'd be happy to see you," the old woman replied, somewhat taken aback but pleasantly surprised that they wanted to see her again. They said their warm goodbyes, and the groom's parents followed their children, who were already waiting by the car. The old woman stood at the doorstep, watching as the vehicle gently pulled away and disappeared into the darkness. Everyone left satisfied and well-fed, except for the bride. She was already outside, wearing an expression of clear irritation on her face. Nothing could please her that evening. Her eyes reflected only exhaustion and discontent. On one hand, she was troubled by her daughter's words, but on the other, she was touched by the warmth with which the in-laws treated her. In that moment, she realized that despite the coldness and alienation from her own daughter, kindness and respect still existed in this world. As soon as she had seen the guests off, Carla calmly began to clear the table. Her movements were measured, almost mechanical. She was accustomed to silence and solitude, and now that silence felt almost blessed after the tense evening. While clearing the dishes and wiping the table, she tried not to think about her daughter's words, even though they still echoed in her mind. "She never loved me," those words cut deeply. But the old woman, accustomed to hiding her feelings, continued tidying up the little house, focusing on simple tasks. When she picked up one of the plates, she suddenly discovered several large bills underneath it. The money was neatly folded, as if someone had intentionally left it there, hoping she would find it after dinner. The old woman froze, slightly frowning in surprise. She slowly picked up the bills, examining them. It was quite a significant sum, and considering how much she had spent on preparing dinner for her guests, this money could be very helpful. But she had always lived by her conscience. Raised in strictness and honesty, she knew that this money did not belong to her. The old woman carefully folded the bills and placed them on the key rack by the front door, deciding to return them to whoever left the money. There was no way she could keep it for herself, no matter how much she needed the money. "I'll return them tomorrow," she thought, sighing with a slight smile. The next day, as promised, the in-laws arrived again. Along with them came the daughter and her fiancé, and the atmosphere was tense from the very beginning. The girl immediately shot an annoyed glance at her mother, as if she was already preparing for a new conflict. Barely stepping over the threshold, she quickly began rummaging through the shelves, opening cabinets, and sifting through things. Her movements were frantic, full of irritation, as though she was in a hurry to find something. "Where did you hide them?" Esther suddenly snapped, not stopping. "You've always done this for as long as I can remember. You put something away and then act like you forgot. You're such a kleptomaniac." The old woman, standing in the corner of the room, silently watched as her daughter turned the house upside down searching for something. With each of Esther's movements and every word she threw out, Carla felt a growing heaviness in her heart. She didn't even immediately grasp what was being discussed. "Esther, what are you looking for?" she asked quietly, but her words drowned in another wave of her daughter's indignation. "Money went missing from Anthony's wallet yesterday," her daughter answered loudly and irritably without even turning around. "And who could have taken it?" "Of course, it was you. As always, you accidentally took something." You have no idea how embarrassed I am." The groom, standing nearby, tried to intervene, but his words were lost in the tumultuous activity of the bride. "Esther, enough. This is pointless. Let's calm down." But the bride didn't listen to him. She continued to dig through her mother's belongings, saying, "I've told you 100 times to be more careful. But you always lose everything or take what's not yours. And now, of course, you've put the money somewhere." Carla remained silent. Her eyes were full of hurt, but she didn't say a word. For a moment, she met the gaze of her in-laws, who stood aside, clearly puzzled by what was happening. They, like Carla, were at a loss. After a couple of minutes, unable to bear the sight any longer, the old woman slowly walked to the key rack by the front door, where she had neatly placed the found money just the night before. She didn't say anything, just took the bills she had discovered under the plate and quietly handed them to the groom. "Here," she said calmly, looking him in the eyes. "I found them last night. Whoever left them, I couldn't take someone else's money." The groom paused for a moment, glancing at the money and then at the old woman. His face flushed slightly, and he felt ashamed that his beloved had reacted so angrily. He carefully took the bills and then turned to Esther. "You were wrong," he said quietly, but without hiding the obvious reproach. "See? Here's the money." Esther stopped, realizing that her accusations were unfounded. She looked at her mother and then at her fiancé, but couldn't find any justification for her behavior. A tense silence hung in the room. When the old woman returned the money, it seemed that everything should have calmed down, but Esther was not about to give up. Her resentment and anger were so deeply rooted that she simply couldn't leave the situation as it was. "Well, of course you found it," she sneered. "You always do this, first you take it, and then pretend you found it. I don't believe it's a coincidence." She had already opened her mouth to continue her accusations when unexpectedly her mother-in-law, who had been holding back until that moment, intervened. It became unbearable for her to see Esther so openly and cruelly accuse her own mother. "Enough!" Amber interrupted sharply, stepping forward. Her voice suddenly became loud, and everyone fell silent at once. "I can't listen to you humiliating your mother any longer." Esther turned to her mother-in-law, clearly not expecting such a turn. "Do you seriously think it's okay to talk to a woman who has done so much for others, including us?" her mother-in-law continued. "Have you forgotten that her family saved our Anthony twice? How dare you demean her like that?" Esther rolled her eyes in response, but it was clear that her words had affected her. "You don't understand," she began. "You don't know what it's like to be abandoned by your own family." "What are you talking about?" the mother-in-law shot back, pain evident in her voice. "Your mother would never have done that. How can you accuse her? You don't know." Esther yelled, no longer hiding her emotions. "All my childhood, they only mourned for my sister. They always talked about her, as if I didn't even exist. I was like a shadow in this family. They expected nothing from me, no good grades, no success. I was never as important to them as she was. It was as if I was just a dull addition that nobody wanted or expected." Esther's words hung in the air, and everyone in the room froze. The mother-in-law stood in shock, while the old woman, sitting in the corner, closed her eyes as if trying to shield herself from the pain brought on by her daughter's words. Those accusations hit her heart with unbearable force. "Esther," the mother-in-law finally spoke, her voice softer but filled with reproach. "I understand that it hasn't been easy for you, but that's no excuse. Feeling neglected doesn't give you the right to humiliate your mother. She buried her own child, buried her husband. It hurt her terribly. You could understand this if you wanted to." The groom, who had been silently watching the unfolding scene, finally intervened. "Esther, I've never heard you talk about this. But you can't keep blaming everyone around you. I didn't know you felt abandoned, but your behavior right now," he sighed, trying to find the right words. "It doesn't reflect well on you at all." Esther pressed her lips together, and her face twisted in a grimace of pain. "You just don't understand," she whispered, looking away. My whole life, I've lived in Irma's shadow. They just lived in the past, mourning her, while I was somewhere in the background. I didn't know how to be their daughter when all their attention was focused on her, even after her death. A dead silence fell in the house, and Esther's words still hung in the air like a leaden cloud before a storm. Carla finally raised her eyes, and they reflected deep pain, but also understanding. "You've always been important to us, Esther," she said softly, trying to speak calmly. "Perhaps Dawn and I didn't do everything perfectly. But we raised you the best we could. And we loved you too, as much as we could." Esther lowered her eyes, but didn't respond. A storm still raged in her heart, but her mother's words made her pause and think. The eldest daughter, who had long since left this world, had always been their ideal, their golden child. She was an honor student, successful, kind, and her future seemed bright and promising. Her parents took pride in her, praised her achievements, and talked about her to friends and colleagues. And then came the tragedy that changed their lives forever. Irma died, and with her, it seemed, all the happiness of that family had vanished. The younger daughter had grown up seemingly in her shadow. Every day, Esther felt that dark presence. The spirit of her older sister lingered in the house, a reminder of who she could never become. Her parents mourned their loss, and all their love, all their care, all their energy flowed into endless grief. The younger daughter grew up in the background, as if she didn't exist at all. Every time her mother spoke of her older sister, her voice filled with warmth and pain, while when it came to Esther, her eyes reflected only fatigue. In Esther's heart, resentment began to fester. She couldn't understand why, instead of supporting her, her parents continued to live in the past. Over time, her hurt transformed into deep-seated hatred, directed primarily at her mother. Since her teenage years, she had dreamed of escaping those feelings, breaking free from that house, from the atmosphere of eternal sorrow and regret. But no matter how far she went, those shadows of the past always caught up with her, forcing her to remember what she was trying to flee. She was angry at Carla, yet at the same time, she couldn't detach herself from her. "You never loved me," she hissed, unable to hold back as the tension in the room thickened. Esther looked at her mother with bitterness, her face expressing a mixture of hurt and pain. "All your attention was always for her. I was like a ghost in this house. Forever in the shadow of a perfect sister I never even met. And you didn't even notice me." The old woman looked at her daughter with genuine sorrow in her eyes, but her face remained calm. "That's not true, Esther," she replied quietly, her voice soft yet tinged with fatigue. "We lost so much, and I always tried to give you love, but maybe I did it wrong." "Wrong?" Esther laughed bitterly, clenching her hands into fists. "You did nothing at all. Always just memories of her. How wonderful she was, how smart she was. And me? I just existed alongside her like a shadow. You never believed in me, you never expected anything good from me." The groom tried to intervene, gently taking Esther's hand. "Esther, please, calm down." But she just pulled her hand away and continued. "I've spent my whole life trying to break free from this. But every time I came back here, that feeling washed over me again. God, I even lived in the apartment that belonged to Irma. I would have loved to escape from you, from all of this, but I couldn't. And yes, I'm angry at you. I wanted to hurt you so that you would feel at least a fraction of what I felt." The room fell into an awkward silence. The in-laws stared at Esther, their shock evident. They couldn't believe that the girl, who should have been happy in the lead-up to her wedding, was so deeply unhappy and full of pain. The old woman, who always seemed to keep her emotions in check, suddenly felt something inside her break. Her daughter's bitter accusations, the pain that had built up over the years, all of it flared up with new intensity. She abruptly stood up, unable to endure it any longer. Her eyes shone with held-back tears, but she no longer cared. She hurried to the cupboard and, with trembling hands, pulled down an old, dusty photo album from the top shelf. "Do you want to know the truth? Do you want to see how it really was?" she snapped, roughly handing the album to her daughter. Look and tell me what you see." Esther froze for a moment. Her mother had never raised her voice at her. But then the girl slowly sat down on the couch and began flipping through the album. The first page showed a photo of her parents on their wedding day, young and happy, with smiles on their faces and light in their eyes. The next pictures showed them renovating their home, covered in paint, laughing, with playful expressions. Then came the photos from Irma's pregnancy and early years. The pictures were beautiful, but there was something different about them. The girl in the photos was growing up, but despite her smile, there was a look of exhaustion in her eyes. Her parents expected too much from her. Classes, tutors, extracurricular activities. In the pictures, it was evident that the girl was becoming increasingly tense over time. Her childhood seemed consumed by endless responsibilities and high expectations. In her graduation photo, she wore a beautiful dress, but her smile looked almost forced. Esther continued to flip through the pages silently, her lips pressed together. When she reached the pictures taken after her sister's death, she paused for a moment, seeing the emptiness in her parents' eyes. Everything around seemed to have lost its color. But after those pictures, when the album turned to her own life, the image began to change. In the photos of the younger daughter, life was completely different. Amusement parks, playgrounds, family trips. In every shot, the girl was genuinely happy, her eyes shining with joy. There was no sign of tension, no trace of exhaustion. This was a girl allowed to be herself, enjoying her childhood without endless expectations and pressure. The old woman, watching her daughter flip through the album, spoke with a tremor in her voice. "You always said you lived in your sister's shadow. But that's not true, Esther. She grew up under such terrible pressure that she couldn't just be a child. We wanted the best for her, but perhaps we went too far. And when she was gone, yes, our lives crumbled, but that doesn't mean you were abandoned. We gave you what we couldn't give her, freedom. You could be yourself, play, laugh, just live." Esther closed the album, slowly lifting her eyes to her mother. Her face was cold, but inside, something had begun to crack. She hadn't expected to see such photos, such a contrast between Irma's life and her own. "I didn't know," she muttered, unsure of what to say. The old woman looked sternly at her daughter, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. With every word she was about to speak, memories that had haunted her soul for years floated before her mind's eye. "We loved you both with all our hearts, Esther," she began, her voice growing weaker. "Your sister and you. But the pain of losing Irma was so great that it consumed us. We always wanted the best for her, always demanded too much. She was our pride, but perhaps we didn't see that under all that responsibility, she was breaking." Esther remained silent, huddled on the couch. "If we hadn't pressured her so much, if we hadn't expected her to be the best at everything," the old woman continued, her voice growing softer, "maybe she wouldn't have pushed herself to such exhaustion. Maybe that evening she would have stayed at work or called a taxi. But she thought she could drive home by herself. And she paid for it." The words were heavy for her, and the memories pulled along a grief that had never quieted. She recalled how they had learned about the accident, how they had watched the footage from the cameras. "We told everyone that some reckless driver swerved into the oncoming lane," the old woman continued quietly. "But that's not true. We saw the recording of that accident. There was no reckless driver. Just two tired, sleepy drivers, just like your sister. They both fell asleep at the wheel on an empty road. They just weren't lucky." Her voice trailed off, and tears glistened in her eyes. Esther listened intently, slowly realizing the full truth. She had always thought of her sister as a victim of someone else's recklessness, but the realization that her tragedy was the result of simple exhaustion shattered her heart even more. The old woman paused to collect herself. "We couldn't cope with it. After burying our eldest child, it took us a long time to recover. It was hard for us to accept that we essentially robbed her of her childhood and the ability to assess her own limits. We pressured her, forced her to be perfect, demanded, and in the end, we lost her." Esther, still at a loss for words, lowered her gaze. Now that she had heard this truth, her resentment toward her mother began to melt away. And then a miracle happened, the mother continued, her voice softening, though a note of sadness lingered. At an age when we no longer expected any gifts from life, I became pregnant again. We didn't know how to react, but one thing was clear, this time, we would do everything differently. We gave you what we couldn't give your sister, the freedom to be yourself. You could be a child, play, laugh. We didn't want to demand the impossible from you, we just wanted you to be happy. Esther raised her eyes to her mother, and something new flickered in her gaze, the realization that she had been wrong all these years. Her parents truly wanted the best for her, but wrapped in grief, they couldn't find the right way to express their love. I didn't know, Esther finally said softly, her voice barely audible, but the former aggression had vanished. I thought I was just a shadow to you. That you didn't care about me. Carla froze. Inside, all the emotions a person could feel boiled over. For the first time in so many years, she was speaking about what she felt. You were never a shadow, she said gently. You were our miracle that brought us back to life. When the truth finally struck Esther, her emotions broke through all the walls she had built inside herself for so long. Tears instantly filled her eyes, and at that moment, when she tried to rise from the couch, the album slipped from her hands and fell to the floor with a dull thud. Esther, not noticing it, nearly stumbled over the old book, but she didn't care. She rushed to her mother, wrapping her arms around her neck and, unable to contain her emotions, sobbed bitterly. Forgive me, Mom, forgive me, she whispered through her tears, squeezing her so tightly as if she feared losing her. I was so wrong. I hated you for loving me so much, her voice trembled, but the words flowed out like a stream, as if she had finally released all the pain that had built up over the years. I didn't understand, I didn't see how much you did for me. Her mother, holding back her own tears, gently stroked her back. Her face expressed endless love and relief. Finally, her daughter understood the truth she had always tried to convey. It's okay, dear, the old woman whispered, her voice soft but filled with such strength and warmth that the words warmed Esther's soul. You don't have to blame yourself. I always loved you, and I always will. We all make mistakes, but a mother's love, it never disappears. They stood there for a long time, embracing, as if all the grievances that had built up over the years melted away in that moment. Esther finally allowed herself to feel the love she had long rejected, fighting her own demons. And she realized that her mother had never been an enemy, she had never tried to humiliate her. All this time, Carla had simply loved her unconditionally, no matter what. After that day, much changed. The relationship between mother and daughter became completely different. Now there was no longer the chasm that had torn them apart all those years. They began to spend more time together, talking about the past and their pain. There was no longer any sense in hiding anything from each other. From then on, Esther never dared to say a harsh word to her mother again. Every time she remembered all the hurtful things she had said to her, her heart broke into pieces. She became attentive to her mother, helping her around the house and sharing heartfelt conversations like never before. I can't change the past, Esther admitted to her mother one calm evening they now spent together, but I will never allow myself to hurt you again. The old woman looked at her daughter with a smile and shook her head. We all change, dear. The important thing is that now we have each other. Now they lived as a real family. Without grievances and unspoken words, without accusations and pain. This was a new chapter in their lives, and no one felt deprived anymore.